Trying to change regime in Iran is not good for the US. Inspired by the views of Daniel Larison, we could actually help the Iranian people by lifting the economic sanctions that are doing them harm. The recent mass protests in Iran sparked by the death of a woman at the hands of the Iranian police have opened a floodgate of heated discussions ranging from sexual politics and faith in the US to renewed calls for a regime change in Iran. The scary part that some public figures have been pushing to align American policy behind the protesters, which they say will give the Biden administration an opportunity to change the Iranian regime, and by doing that to restore the American dignity. It is not surprising that pro-regime change evangelists see every event as an occasion to agitate for regime change, but they are as deeply misguided as ever when they insist that pursuing this goal is the appropriate role for the US government. Let us set aside the American nuclear negotiations with Iran for a moment and let us ask whether it makes any sense for the US to insert itself into these protests. The Iranian government is calling protesters agents working on behalf of foreign governments, so the idea of the US getting involved would add credibility to those accusations. The wiser course of action is to refrain from becoming involved so that our government does not aggravate the protesters' difficulties and so that it does not create false expectations of more direct intervention down the road. The US should recognize the limits on its influence in a country that our government understands very poorly and where it has not had a diplomatic presence in more than 40 years. The US should not seek to exploit popular protests for destructive ends. There is nothing dignified about intruding into another country's affairs in an attempt to topple its government. Even talking about these protests as a means to achieve regime change plays into the hands of the government's propaganda. If the US started making policy with an eye towards using Iranian protesters as if they were pawns in a regime change policy, that would be deeply wrong and also likely to blow up in our faces. While the US can and should criticize the Iranian government's use of violence against protesters, there is very little that our government could do that would be constructive and welcome inside Iran. Trying to hijack an Iranian cause to advance a fanatical interventionist goal is exactly what the US should never do. The most useful thing that the US government could do is to get out of the way of the Iranian people by suspending or lifting as many of the sanctions that throttle them as possible. In the worst case, tens of millions of ordinary Iranians would be at least slightly better off than they were before, and in the best case that might even lead to some real change for the better. At the very least, the US would not be inflicting as much needless pain on innocent people. Sanctions not only impoverish huge numbers of ordinary people, but in so doing they steal time and energy away from those that might use the lost time and energy to seek improvements in their political system. The impact of sanctions on Iranian society is that the sanctions have already impeded their ability to protest. Here is why. Economic uncertainty makes it harder to organize and to maintain protest movements. Many Iranians literally cannot afford to protest and to go on strikes for fear of losing their jobs. Even those who can afford to protest have difficulty organizing, as civil society organizations that help mobilize the middle class like charities, advocacy groups, legal aid providers are starved of resources. Although economic hardships could spur more protests, what we are currently seeing in Iran is that the protests tend to be smaller and more fleeting with time. Broad sanctions are a sustained, cruel attack on the people of the targeted country, so if our government wanted to help ordinary Iranians it would put an end to that attack with substantial sanctions relief. Years of economic warfare have empowered hardliners and tightened the grip of Iran's authoritarian government, and it would be foolish to think that continuing with more of the same bankrupt pressure tactics will produce any better results. That was the view from the Red Corner. Thanks for listening.